Hello, this is Dr. Grande. Today I'll analyze the Netflix documentary, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey? This documentary was released in November 2024. Over 3 episodes, it tells the story of a notorious murder and the investigation that followed. First, I'll look at the background of this case, move to the timeline of the crime, then offer my analysis. JonBenét Patricia Ramsey was born on August 6, 1990, and was raised in Boulder, Colorado. She lived with her father, John, her mother, Patsy, and her older brother, Burke, at 755 15th Street. Her family was wealthy. The house was over 6,500 square feet. It had a basement and 4 levels, although the 4th level was just a master bedroom. At one time, JonBenét's mother, Patsy, had been a beauty queen. She entered JonBenét in multiple child beauty pageants. Now moving to the timeline of the crime. On December 26, 1996, at 5:52 a.m., Patsy Ramsey called 911 and reported that she found a ransom note on a staircase going to the basement of her house. The note indicated that her 6-year-old daughter, JonBenét Ramsey, had been kidnapped. Despite the ransom note warning against contacting anyone, Patsy called family and friends and told them what was going on. The police arrived to the Ramsey residence within 3 minutes of the 911 call. Here is what they found during the course of their investigation. John, Patsy, and Burke were in the house. Officers just assumed that JonBenét had been kidnapped and did not bother to search the house. They did, however, secure JonBenét's bedroom. An examination of the ransom note revealed it had been written to Mr. Ramsey and demanded $118,000. This amount was nearly identical to a Christmas bonus John had received in 1995. The note indicated the kidnappers would call between 8 and 10 a.m. It was John's intent to pay the ransom. However, the call never came in. No kidnapper ever made contact with the Ramseys. At about 1 p.m., 7 hours into the investigation, the police asked John and one of his neighbors who came over to the house to search the house to see if anything was amiss. John walked directly to the basement and came up carrying the body of JonBenét. He claimed that he found her behind a latched door going behind a room that was rarely used. Her body was covered with a white blanket, a cord was wrapped around her wrists and her neck, and it looked like she had been strangled with a garrote. This weapon had been fashioned from a broken piece of a paintbrush and a length of nylon. Duct tape had been on JonBenét's mouth, but John removed the tape before he carried her upstairs to the police. Later, an autopsy revealed that JonBenét died from either a skull fracture or strangulation. There was no sign of forced entry into the Ramsey house, but it was later determined that a door and a few windows were left unlocked that night. In the basement, there was a broken window. John said he had broken it sometime earlier when he locked himself out of the house. The window had never been repaired. There was a suitcase under the window with a small piece of glass on it. The paintbrush used to fashion the garrote had been broken into 3 pieces. One part was used to make the weapon. The part containing the bristles was found in a tub of art supplies which belonged to Patsy. The other part was never found. As far as the weapon that created the skull fracture, the police did not know what was used. They found a baseball bat outside and a flashlight in the kitchen, but no physical evidence connected those items to the murder. The paper for the ransom note came from one of Patsy's notepads and was written with a Sharpie similar to ones that Patsy owned. Apparent references to the movies Dirty Harry and Speed were used in the note, which matched movie posters found in the house. There were no witnesses to the murder, but 2 neighbors had information. One neighbor said that at about midnight, he saw dim lights in the upper kitchen of the Ramsey house. The other neighbor heard a scream at around midnight coming from the Ramsey house. This woke her up. The scream sounded like it was generated by a child. JonBenét Ramsey had pineapple in her stomach when she died. There was a bowl of pineapple on the kitchen table with a spoon in it. This bowl contained Patsy's fingerprints. According to John and Patsy, they did not remember putting the bowl on the table or giving pineapple to JonBenét. There were 2 pairs of small rectangular marks on JonBenét's body, which could have come from a stun gun, but there is no indication that the Ramseys owned a stun gun. Some investigators thought the marks were created by toy train tracks, which were in the basement. Initially, investigators implied that John and Patsy may have been responsible for the murder. Investigators never suspected their son Burke. He was cleared of any involvement right away. In 1999, a grand jury recommended charges against John and Patsy, but not for murder. The grand jury thought the couple had put JonBenét in harm's way. The district attorney decided not to prosecute the case. In June 2006, 49-year-old Patsy Ramsey died from ovarian cancer. In 2008, the district attorney declared that John and Patsy were completely cleared of any involvement in the murder based on the results of DNA testing. DNA was found under JonBenét's fingernails and on her underwear, but the quality of the samples was not ideal. The DNA from the underwear belonged to an unknown male. Every member of JonBenét's family was excluded. At the time I'm making this video, the murder of JonBenéт Ramsey is unsolved. John Ramsey is pushing for additional DNA testing, which he believes could help identify the killer. Now moving to my analysis. There are essentially two main theories as far as who murdered JonBenét Ramsey. Either the Ramseys were somehow responsible, or an intruder was guilty. For many years after JonBenét's murder, the police fed the media information, some of which was false, suggesting that her parents committed the murder. Despite many investigators working on the case for a long time, the Ramseys were never charged with any crime. Investigators argued vigorously about the Ramseys, with some believing they were guilty and others believing they were innocent. The Netflix documentary, Who Killed JonBenét Ramsey, is really not focused as much on finding the killer as showing how John and Patsy Ramsey were not responsible. Did the documentary make an effective argument on behalf of the couple? Was the couple involved in the murder? As I mentioned, there are only two theories about who is responsible for the murder. If the Ramseys were not involved, then an intruder was the killer. With this in mind, let's take a look at the evidence both for and against the idea that the Ramseys were involved. Starting with the inculpatory factors. John and Patsy were in the house when their daughter was killed. If a neighbor heard a scream at around midnight, why didn't the Ramseys hear it? An officer who was in the house before JonBenét's body was discovered said that John Ramsey went directly to the basement after being told to search for items which were out of place. By John bringing his daughter's body upstairs from the basement, he contaminated the crime scene. He had been instructed prior to this to leave everything where it was found. The house that the Ramseys lived in was large and fairly complex as far as the layout. How did an intruder know how to navigate the house? Patsy's paintbrush was used in the murder, and the ransom note was from a notebook that belonged to her. The ransom demand was for an amount of money, $118,000, which was close to a Christmas bonus John had received the year before. The ransom note was cordial, long, and contained information which is unusual for this kind of note. Why did the kidnapper leave a ransom note and then fail to call? What was the point of doing all that work to write the note? The Ramseys could not explain the bowl of pineapple, but Patsy's fingerprints were on the bowl. Now moving to the exculpatory factors. Several handwriting experts believe that Patsy did not write the ransom note. Even though the note was very unusual, the intruder theory involves the perpetrator entering the house hours before the Ramseys came home that night. He would have had time to write a long note. Maybe he wrote it because his intent was kidnapping, but then something went wrong. Perhaps the movie posters inspired some of the wording. If a person was disturbed enough to commit this murder, it stands to reason they would manifest other bizarre behavior in their life. This could explain the strange nature of the note. As far as listing John's bonus as the ransom demand, there was a document in plain view containing the bonus amount. The main theory featuring Patsy as the killer involves her accidentally killing JonBenét. Based on the autopsy results, it is clear that JonBenét was alive when she was being horribly attacked. This means the killing wasn't accidental, and even a terrible mother would have trouble doing that to her own daughter. There was no forced entry into the house. However, the broken window in the basement could have easily been the access point for an intruder. Investigators had no trouble moving through that window into the house. The suitcase placed in front of the broken window may have been used as a step to climb back out of the window after the murder was done. In the months leading up to the murder, there had been 100 burglaries in the neighborhood where the Ramseys lived. In September 1997, About 9 months after the murder, an intruder attacked a 14-year-old girl inside her residence. This occurred not far from the Ramseys' house. The victim went to the same dance studio as JonBenét. The intruder, in this case, was never apprehended. If the small rectangular marks on JonBenét's body were caused by a stun gun, this points to an intruder because there is no indication the Ramseys owned a stun gun. As I mentioned, a paintbrush was used in the crime. It was broken into 3 pieces, but one part was never found. How would the Ramseys have disposed of this piece? DNA found on JonBenét excluded every member of her family, which of course includes John and Patsy. When considering all the evidence in this case, do I believe that John and Patsy were responsible for JonBenét's death? In my first video about this case, which I made years ago, I believe there was a reasonable doubt as to their guilt, but I thought it was more likely than not they were responsible. So based on the balance of probabilities, I thought they were involved. At this point, after considering the DNA evidence and a few other factors, I am now convinced the probability of their guilt is less than 50%. Put another way, I believe it's more likely an intruder was responsible. The ransom note has always been a major problem for the Ramseys. It's the one piece of evidence that points strongly toward Patsy. However, when weighing all the evidence, I no longer believe the Ramseys did it. The intruder must have written the note. This, of course, provides an answer to another question. Did the documentary do a good job of arguing in favor of the Ramseys? I believe it did. Particularly compelling components of the documentary included the low quality of the police investigation and how the police sent misinformation to the media to put pressure on the Ramseys. At this point, the police need to focus on the DNA evidence. It's probably the only chance of solving this case. Maybe the advent of more sophisticated tests and the use of genetic genealogy will finally bring the killer to justice. Or perhaps this is one of those cases which will forever remain a mystery. Now moving to my final thoughts. The JonBenét Ramsey murder captivated the media and the public for decades. What was it about this case that attracted so much interest? What is the recipe for a criminal case to become notorious? I think it was a combination of factors. The victim's participation in beauty pageants, especially given her age, was unusual and meant a lot of photographs were available. The murder took place in a mansion in an upscale community, and the victim's parents were wealthy. A long and peculiar ransom note was left behind. Very few cases involve a ransom note of any type. The victim's father discovered the body instead of the police discovering the body. The nature of the crime itself is almost unheard of. A murder of one family member in an occupied house overnight that goes undetected for hours. The victim's parents hired public relations experts after the murder, which a lot of people found to be bizarre. It's like they had an unusual set of priorities. In the years following the murder, various suspects falsely confessed to the crime, which kept public interest alive. And the case was never solved. When looking at all the atypical factors involved in this case, it is not surprising the murder became notorious. Those are my thoughts on the documentary, Who Killed JonBenéт Ramsey? Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon. There's one theory about this case that has been introduced that I wanted to talk about briefly. It is an unlikely scenario, but I think it's worth mentioning, if only to explain why it does not appear to make a lot of sense. Some people have argued that an intruder committed the murder, but Patsy Ramsey wrote the ransom note. Usually, the way this case is conceptualized, whoever wrote the ransom note must have been the killer. The idea that a person not involved in the murder wrote the note is, of course, inconsistent with that main conceptualization. The idea here is that maybe Patsy discovered her daughter's body and became worried because the situation looked really bad for her and for her husband. Like, they looked guilty. No one was going to believe that they were not involved. In a failed effort to ensure people suspected an intruder, Patsy wrote the ransom note. Her plan backfired in a spectacular fashion, as the note became the key evidence against her. Whenever people are examining an unsolved case, it is important to keep an open mind, but I don't think this theory is likely. Under this scenario, Patsy was not involved in the murder, yet after discovering the homicide, she had the presence of mind to write this long note. Furthermore, she was calm enough to write it. This theory is inconsistent with how people function. It doesn't take into account how Patsy would have been very upset, mostly because of the murder part. Even though an intruder writing a note would be a low probability event, Patsy writing it and not being involved in the crime would be even less likely. I think it makes more sense that Patsy was innocent and the intruder was a peculiar and atypical killer.